Let there be nothing in your heart but love. Our heart is like a garden. Depending on how we take care of it, that is the state and condition of the plants in the garden. So if we constantly nurture love, compassion, understanding, and wisdom, our heart will be like a garden full of roses, full of fountains where birds come and play and rest, and one finds true peace and tranquility. But if we harbor nothing but anger and resentment and hatred toward one another, then that garden will be dry. There will be nothing there, nothing living. No birds or animals would want to come there. No person would want to go there to rest. You see, resentment is one of the worst qualities we can ever have towards someone. It's something that just keeps growing inside us, often underneath our very own eyes, underneath our very own nose. We sometimes don't notice that this resentment is creeping up and taking over our heart and destroying everything inside this garden. There's this wonderful quote that Buddha had where he basically said that anger is something like holding on to a hot coal before throwing it at someone else. You yourself are the one that's going to get burned before anyone else does. And that's pretty much true with any kind of resentment, whether it's a resentment that we have towards our partner, towards our family members, towards friends, even towards random strangers. Sometimes we have a sense of hatred or just being reviled by another person. Sometimes we can't even explain it. We don't really know the reasons why. But if we take the time to reflect upon it, all forms of resentment come from a lack of understanding, come from a lack of awareness. You see, there's this insecurity that builds up, an insecurity and also an inability to see ourselves as one with the rest of humanity. After all, if you truly see yourself as equal to everyone else, then there is no one left to resent anymore because you would be resenting yourself. So therefore, it must mean that when you resent someone or when you harbor negative feelings about them, it means that you view them differently than yourself. And sometimes resentment can come from feeling offended or feeling insecure about another person. But if you think about it, and as I explain in a lot of my videos, the thing or person that's being offended is actually not really ourselves, but rather the ego. The ego that is our false self, the ego that is the unaware mind, the illusion, the veil that we put up and that we identify to be ourselves. But in reality, it is nothing but an illusion. The ego is the one that gets offended by someone else's actions or behaviors. The ego is the one that gets offended by other people doing what we perceive injustices to us. But the soul, the calm and beautiful essence that we are, doesn't get offended by these things. It doesn't get riled up into action. It doesn't feel the need to defend itself. It never feels insecure. It never feels like it is not loved. And that is where, when we talk about opposites, right, the opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is fear, the fear of not being loved. Where there is fear, it means that there's not enough love. Of course, love is there, it's just that we can't see it. And that's where resentment starts to grow. Resentment starts from a level of insecurity, which starts from a level of fear. And that fear ultimately comes because there is not enough love. There is not enough understanding and awareness of our true nature, of the true nature of everyone else around us. And that's why we react in certain ways that we do. If we get into an argument with our partner, for example, we'll get very defensive. We might say things that we don't mean. We might feel things that are not really true. We might harbor a level of resentment that can build for days, if not weeks or even months. Sometimes when you see relationships and couples start to fracture, it's not usually one fight or one argument, it's things that have been building up over time. And all of a sudden, there might be kind of that triggering point that comes out and really is the straw that breaks the camel's back. But it's really a layers and layers of resentment being built up over time. Or it could be with just random strangers. For example, let's say if you're driving and someone just happens to cut you off, you might say a couple of choice words that I can't repeat now, but in that moment, you feel like someone has done some sort of injustice towards you, that you are a victim in some way, and that your resentment is justified. But in either case, whether that resentment is short lived or whether it lasts for years, none of those feelings are really meaningful. None of those attitudes really have substance. And they come from a lack of understanding, they come from a lack of love. So when you go back to this analogy of how do you want to nurture this garden, think about all the ways that you have chosen to not tender and to not tend to your garden. Think about all the ways that perhaps you have let that resentment creep in. It's a little bit like going uphill or downhill, right? If we want to do good things in life, it's a bit like going uphill. It's not in the natural course of the ego to try to do things that are good and wholesome. Rather, the ego wants us to slip into unconscious behavior. It wants us to do things that separate us further and further away from our true essence. So, following the ego is a bit like going downhill. There's not that much work or effort required. Gravity will just do all the work. But awakening from the ego, awakening from resentment, cultivating true and unconditional love in our hearts is like going uphill. It's like climbing that mountain. But here's the catch, it's very challenging at first, but the greatest reward is also comes from growing uphill, right? No one ever feels satisfied by just walking a couple of steps on the sidewalk or walking downhill. But if you climb for days or if you climb for hours and you finally reach the summit of that mountain and you see this beautiful view of a lake with trees and the sky, the endless sky above you, that is the true reward. And the same is true for our spiritual journey, right? Awakening from resentment, cultivating love seems very difficult at first. It takes time and patience and dedication to not get triggered by when someone cuts us off or when someone says something about us that might seem hurtful on the surface but doesn't really affect us at our core. Over time, we start to unravel all those different layers, all those different veils that have been covering who we really are. And we get to a spot and we get to a place that nothing and no one can ever hurt us anymore. That might sound like a utopian sort of world, but if you think about it, no one can hurt you. Nothing can hurt you unless you give it the permission to do so. Right? I always try to think of it like having some sort of a shield or having some sort of a distance. Whenever someone says something hurtful or does something that might hurt the ego, I've created kind of like this mental shield. And the shield will bear all that impact. And it'll take a lot for that shield to start to crack and wither and break down. In fact, a lot of people have even told me, I've never really seen you get mad before. I've never really seen you get angry before. And, one of the common, sort of tricks that I've learned to develop over the years is to have kind of this shield that protects me from the ego, this shield that protects me from the outside world. Even when people will directly mention my name or directly, address me in a certain way or have some sort of a comment or remark, I'm often surprised myself how there's very little that actually gets to me. There's very little that affects me because those comments will come and go. Those feelings of hatred and resentment will come and go, but my essence is always here to stay. It doesn't change, it doesn't get affected, it doesn't get impacted. And as long as I keep reminding myself of this, I only nurture love towards that person. I only nurture understanding toward that person. Now, you may be wondering, how can you give love to someone that is giving you hate, that is giving you resentment? The trick is to not look at the hate and resentment itself, because that is just a manifestation of the ego. The trick is to look at the person or the soul behind the hate and resentment. Because if you think about it, we are not the emotions that we occupy. If we were, we'd be changing 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day. We are the calm, peaceful stillness behind all these different emotions. The analogy I like to use is, we're the sky behind the clouds. The sky is always the sky, but the clouds are always changing. The emotions are always changing. If someone was mean to you one day, they might be nice to you the other day. If someone is laughing with you one day, they might be crying with you the next day. So humans are very complex creatures, right? We're always subject to so many different personalities, so many different moods and behaviors, but our natural essence is all the same. It doesn't matter if you're young or old. It doesn't matter what race you are, what nationality you are, where you live in the world. Your essence is the same. And once you start to see this unchanging essence within you, you can start to notice it in everyone else. It's like noticing that we all are like a candle, that every single candle, no matter what the shape is or the color is, has the same property. You put a match to it or you put a source of flame to it, and it starts to light up and it starts to burn. And we can use that candle to start lighting up every other candle and inspiring everyone else on their journey. So I know I shared a lot here, but what I hope you really take away from this video is that resentment is a terrible, terrible quality to have. Of course, the people that have the most resentment are the ones most unaware that they have this resentment. The key to overcoming any form of resentment, any form of hatred, is to first and foremost develop an awareness. Develop an awareness of who is actually saying these words, who is actually harboring these negative thoughts and feelings. Because we may think in that act of saying something mean or doing something wrong that we're hurting the other person. But in reality, and as Buddha wonderfully described in that quote, we are the ones hurting ourselves. We are the ones burning. And so, if for nothing else but to help our own selves, we should try to eliminate all forms of resentment within our being. The body is not meant to have resentment. This is why we have stress. This is why we have endless thoughts. This is why we have so many physical, mental problems, because we've let that resentment fester inside of us like a disease. It's time to now heal that disease. It's time to heal the body, the mind, and the soul. So I thank you guys for taking some time to learn a little bit more about resentment and how we can overcome it to nurture love and compassion, both for ourselves, but also for others. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. If you have any sort of examples that you can share, or just maybe some tips and tricks that have worked for you, just like the mental shield that I talked about earlier. If you enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to drop a like, share it with anyone that you think might benefit, and also take some time, if you have some free time, to check out some of the other videos on the channel. I always love kind of hearing the different perspectives, the different insights that you guys have to offer, and a lot of that comes from the different forms of content that I try to frequently produce on this channel. But other than that, thank you again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully very soon on another one of these videos.